Right, we're live, Richie. I can't quite believe we've never had you on our little stream before. We had your partner, Claire Robbie, which is obviously how you and I met on here a couple of years ago. And I was extremely green in this whole space then. And Claire very kindly allowed me to interview her, and her profile helped get a bit of, leverage for us on our little channel, which is super cool. But I wanted to get you on today because you're definitely one of our more well-known, colourful clients, and obviously a good friend of mine. And I really wanted to, before I let you take it away, which you're very adept at, and do some riffing of your own, I really wanted to sort of go down the whole line of exploring, like giving you a further platform to explain who you are, what you do, but also how we've helped you a little bit lately to fit that benevolent, passionate zest for helping people and addressing some of the really sticky social issues we have in society at the moment into a structure for you where you're able to fairly remunerate yourself, take a little bit of comfort in earning some money so that you can continue to do that and provide for your family. And I thought we'd start on that note and let you take it away.
Thanks, bro. Well, thanks for having me. I'm always appreciative of the interest, so thank you. I hope it's worth the time of anyone who's tuning in to listen. Yeah, so I do a bunch of things that have come to coalesce. Historically, I used to be a competitive Thai boxer. I used to fight Muay Thai, and I won a bunch of titles and stuff back in the day. And I moved into coaching sort of once I retired. And whilst I was still fighting, and I put myself through university. So I gave myself kind of a broad degree in the humanities, looking at sociology and political science. I did a degree in Spanish and looked at things in Latin American context. And I'm back at uni at the moment, actually, doing a master's degree in sociology, looking at masculinity. And that all has come together to really underpin the work I do around family violence prevention, talking about mental health and substance abuse, sexual violence prevention, and looking at how do boys grow up to be men, and what is wrong in our culture that means that so many boys become violent men, or so many boys take their own lives, or so many boys become men who hurt their partners, because no one wants to do any of those things. No one wakes up and dreams of being domestically abusive, or wrapping their car around a power pole, or becoming a problematic drug user, right? Like, these aren't the things on our to-do list as children. And yet statistically, boys and men are about 93% of the prison population, 2/3 of fatal car accidents, predominantly overrepresented in suicide statistics, and far and away the biggest perpetrators of domestic violence, and also the biggest perpetrators and yet also victims of homicidal violence in the street. You know what I mean? So when we talk about that sort of stuff, we need to look at the social issues the social drivers, social causatives, about why we're acculturated towards all these things. So I guess, and all of that stems from me unpacking my own lived experience. I've been very public, and my dad's been really cool about it, with the fact that my father is an alcoholic and continues to struggle with his alcoholism. And he's of the generation, that never talked about masculinity and never talked about mental health. And the more I've come to understand myself, the more I've had to understand, like, my family line. My great grandfather came back from World War I traumatized, which led to my grandfather being raised in a certain way by a single mother in the 20s, which of course impacted my father, which of course impacted me, So we all have these, all of us, we all have these family histories and lived histories that shape us inside a broader environment. And it's the sort of stuff I talk about, but I do it in a more relatable way most of the time with young people, or with athletes and sports teams. I try and make the academia that underpins all of this digestible and also relatable. You know, I think the more I've been in this space, a lot of the conversations around social change and social progress are very much ivory tower, or they're very much like a cool kids club. You know, you have to fit into a certain way of talking about social justice in 2021, and if you deviate from it, adios puto, you know, like you're out the gate. So you have to yeah. I try my best to
I think you also have to, Richie, I think from my experience, you also, because I'm an alcoholic addict myself, as you know, a lot of people watching know. My experience as well is that it has to also, not only do you have to be perceived as using a certain lingo or having a certain background or pedigree to speak about these things in a way that has credibility, you also can't be from, say, for example, the right, or you can't be from an echelon or perceived echelon of society which stands for ostensibly other things which preclude you from being able to act in that way. Translate that back into, because
I
the same thing.
with that,
yeah.
Because I am cognizant that if we're to use the terminology of intersectionality, right? Like there are different levels of structural oppressions, for want of a bit of a word, that affect us all differently. And I do have privilege because I'm a heterosexual white guy, and I'm fully cognizant of that. And so are you. But at the same time, those things don't preclude us from struggling with addiction, with mental health, with our own shitty lived histories. And I think it's about being mindful there of those things at the same time. Like, I think sometimes it's a very binary one or the other sort of conversation that we have these days. And the internet is massively to blame for that. Just the nature of conversation online, where people become abstracts and people become very 2D. It's like, wow, you can't be a national voter and an alcoholic because you didn't have a deprived childhood, right? Like, that's just clearly not true. And I think that's also
I've actually been like kind of questioned slightly, kind of in a veiled kind of way, attacked for helping out my own, so to speak, like white middle class lawyers or professionals who have issues. And my response to that, not that I feel justified I have to give one, because I mostly ignore it, particularly if it's online. But my response to that, if anyone wants to confront me about that face to face, which I'd prefer anyway, is that, well, someone has to help these other people like me. And there are lots of people out there that help people from the whole economic, backgrounds.
Yeah. Sorry, can I swear in this podcast? I don't know.
Sweet.
Yeah. It's kind of like people are people. Like, we're all human beings. And I think that's where I get frustrated too, is that, like, we've got so much more in common as humans than we do in difference. And yet, at present, we live in a time which is about magnifying difference and further atomizing society. And that I struggle with that, because we have this well-documented, well-publicized mental health crisis, and yet society is becoming more and more divisive. And technology is partially to blame for that. COVID-19 is partially to blame for that. But I also think ideology is partially to blame for that. And if we can look for more shared humanity, and each one reach one, each one teach one, everyone's out there using their ability to help one another when and where they can, that should be a good thing. And you should never have to defend the good that you're doing. Like, it's a weird one for me. Like, oh, you're doing it wrong, helping people you don't know. It's kind of a thing these days. And it's kind of, I spend a lot of time thinking about it. I've been reading a lot of literature about this phenomena, because you mentioned at the outset of this interview that you helped me set up the way I do business better, and that's because there needs to be some degree of sustainability in the charitable work that I do. I donate a fair amount of time, energy, and expertise to help people who are disadvantaged and come from, all the shitty statistical readings that you might see in the paper, like.
Hey, that's an understatement. You have a huge amount of time and energy to it.
Yeah, and what you're doing by helping me, I guess, structure my business as a charitable entity means that I will have more time and more resources to help more people once that's set up. Because at the moment, a lot of the stuff I do is for free, but I'm not financially secure person some of the time, man. I live like week to week, month to month sometimes. I'm like, oh, I hope that invoice that I sent 3 months ago gets paid because the rent's coming up. And once I don't have to, and when you have that, well, I'll do this paid work over here, and that means I have to cancel the charitable work that I'm doing. Eventually, I have to put paying for my kid and my rent first some of the time, when in fact, I'd like to be able to do all those things at the same time. And so your expertise and knowledge of the law and paperwork and all the stuff that I'm quite crap at allows me to do that. Do you know what I mean? And then that better allows me to contribute and give back to society.
A lot of people like you, Richie, is like we talked about it before we came on air, is there's almost, and it's a historical sort of anachronism, or there's a perceived, it's like you shouldn't, it's binary. You should be the way you are and put all your energy into helping people and doing all that, or you're, a capitalist and you're money hungry.
Yeah. Well, I used to think like that. I used to fully think like that. When I was graduating with a degree in politics in my late 20s, fuck, I was painful. Like I look back and I'm like, oh, I was a dick. Like I screamed it. I didn't scream, but like I debated everyone depending on who they voted for, and I was like, smash the capitalist state. And I went to like socialist Chile. I went to Chile and like romanticized Salvador Allende, who I still respect and think it's a real shame that American imperialism overthrew a democratic elected socialist government. But like I went to Cuba and I went to all these different places, and I thought Hugo Chavez was Jesus, and I think all those wonderful socialist movements have heaps of benefit to I don't know, to humanity. And I do wonder what like the world would look like if capitalism, neoliberal capitalism, wasn't the economic model that we live under. But I can't conceptualize it. So I've had to learn to understand that. Pardon me?
Work within it.
Yeah, I've had to work within it. Yeah. And I understand that, hey, just because someone's rich and they drive a nice car doesn't mean that they're a bad person. Even, just because someone votes differently to me doesn't mean that they're a bad person. And actually, kindness is a verb. It's not like a political idea. I know some people, I've seen some people who have the same political worldview as I do be horrible people in their personal lives or in their behavior online or whatever. And I'm just like, ugh, that's really mean. And that's like, I wouldn't aspire to that. You're not practicing what you propose to believe in your day-to-day life. You're cruel and you're vicious and malicious. And I've seen other people who vote macroeconomically in a different sense than I do, be very kind and be very generous. And it's forced me to like have a fair degree of cognitive dissonance, and I had to grapple with these ideas and within myself and learn that who you vote for isn't necessarily a reflection of how moral you are or how good a person you are. And that comes down to our individual choices and behaviors. And you can agree to disagree politically and still do good things together. Do you know what I mean? Like we've kind of, like this massive polarization that we've seen emerge since about 2016, and the Trump era didn't help that. Has really kind of divorced us from our going back to the point, our common humanity, right? And then the news media environment is so there are so many voices now that we can't find an objective reality to agree upon, and there are like alternate truths going on out there. Like people can't agree on just like base point stuff anymore, and that's really worrying. Like I do genuinely worry about the world my stepson's grown up in, and other people's kids are growing up in, and I worry about when society gets too polarized and we can't see ourselves in people we disagree with anymore. It does lead to like violence, and we're starting to see that. We're starting to see that in the United States and elsewhere in the world, and we're starting to see weird rallies down here. We have like people in QAnon t-shirts in Wellington, like protesting and stuff. And right now, people can laugh about that, but eventually, things will escalate if we're not mindful of doing something about the polarizing, dehumanizing effect of political discourse on the internet.
I think. Do you think that? I often think that because I also studied political science at University of Auckland.
Oh, I didn't know that. I thought you just did law.
No, I did politics, history, double major, and law. And I studied under Paul Cannon quite a bit, and I did a lot of
really? He lost his job. He lost his job there.
Yeah, he got a bit. He put it this way: he voiced publicly some of the opinions he'd been voicing privately for years, and it didn't go so well for him. But
yeah, I know. Yeah,
fascinating.
He'd be doubly cooked.
Oh,
but yeah, I was a big fan of his brain. I enjoyed his lecture. Yeah,
really bright guy, really interesting guy. Yeah, I just got more out of him than anyone else in that whole department put together. And a lot of what I took from that, I mean, one day he said, it was the election, and he said, who here voted? And say there was 42 of us, and I think maybe 25 of us put up our hands. He said, well, look at that. So we live in a country, you guys are like the elite, so to speak, in terms of you're in university, you or your parents have enough money to put you through university, and 65% possibly of this class who's interested in politics is voting, which says a lot. He goes, these democracies, global democracies, have raised nations full of apathetic voters who take it for granted that we don't have some of the things that have gone on. But what's happening in the States lately is a vivid reminder of the fact that it isn't just peaceful. It's not just to be taken for granted that we have relatively peaceful society. That could go on a heartbeat. All we've ever known in New Zealand is a relatively peaceful society. But like you said, there are just small cracks appearing, I agree, where possibly that won't stay the same forever. And if certain things aren't done about certain things, and you're more the articulate, eloquent one in your backyard, so to speak, to talk about those social and economic issues, not someone like myself, but it's just interesting that we are seeing that it may not always be that way. It's not just a given that we're going to have a peaceful society.
Yeah, I totally agree, And what tends to happen, whether it's in the fashion trends, music trends, or political trends, is what happens in America. It filters down to other liberal Western democracies like our own, So I'm worried about that, There's this big, we had the mosque shooting. I think that's the starkest reminder that internet radicalization will lead to people getting murdered horrifically. And that individual was radicalized by groups of like-minded people in dark corners online. And we need to do a better job of helping those people come out of the said corners. And I worry that when we scream at one another on the internet and shame people and blame them and mock them and make fun of them for thinking the right thing, or thinking the wrong thing, or for just not being educated about the nature of privilege or the nature of what discrimination might look like, or listening to other people's lived experiences, and we attack those people, well, they're going to retreat and find a tribe of their own that reinforces them, right? And we're starting to see that. You know, we see, like, are you familiar with the incel community online?
I know
You know,
what it is.
like the incel community. If you're not familiar with it, incel stands for involuntary celibate. Like, it's a group of super misogynistic young men who believe that they've been shut out of the sexual marketplace, quote unquote, by the fact that alpha men dominate said marketplace, and beta men such as themselves don't get a look in when it comes to dating or access to sex. It's quite messed up. It's a very sad ideology, but again, like, it's fostered online, and it leads to violence. You know, in I think it was Vancouver, maybe 3 years ago, a young man was part of that community, drove into a crowd of people, killing a bunch of people. You know, I think it was Elliot. Is it Elliot Smith? Forgive me the name, but again,
You're forgiven.
Another incel stormed a sorority and shot dead a bunch of women within the last few years. Again, he's part of the online community, and that troubles me. And that's on the men's rights activist sphere. And then you have, obviously, really racist, xenophobic spheres coming out of the right. And on the left, we do have an increasing glorification of violence with hashtags like punch a Nazi. And, you know, you see that image of Richard Spencer getting punched in the face, which at first, I admit, I'm like, lol, you know, a Nazi got punched. But when I think about it, for me to support an image like that supports violence, and I don't support violence for political means. Because
Do you think that social media?
we all lose that
social
thing.
media,
and social media exacerbates that, and I think we need to be mindful of that. Like, I think people like myself, who are, I would argue, left wing and progressively minded, and I basically want the same things I've always wanted. I just disagree with the means of getting to those ends. There's a lot of younger activists these days. I think we need to be mindful of that what starts out as a meme or a joke or an idea leads to people getting hurt or killed. And I don't say that lightly. I think we need to really be mindful that what we encourage on the internet will eventually come off the internet. And that can be the extreme end of it, like we've been talking about with the mosque shooting, down to like a more micro level of people committing suicide after internet shaming or internet bullying, you know? Excuse me.
is
And
internet, is social media,
man.
and the internet.
Oh, they're fucked up spaces, and yet they're really useful spaces.
Yeah, but social
They got to build a business off them, you know?
Is social media a problem? Is social media, has social media caused the more problems and exacerbated tendencies, and given a vehicle, so to speak, for this behavior, and created it in an instrumental way? Or is it just exposed human nature for what it is, which is driving it?
It's a hard question, chicken or the egg, horse or the cart. But I would argue, and I'm not an expert in this space, so take it with a grain of salt, I would argue that it's definitely exacerbated things, because there are neurological chemicals that pop off in our brain when we get likes and retweets and shares. And I'm reading a brilliant book by Marcus Gilroy Weir called Filling the Void, and it talks about how in late capitalist society, where, you know, hundreds of millions of us struggle with anxiety or depression, or indeed just a life that is unfulfilling. We're working jobs that we don't really like. We never see our families to pay for mortgages that we can't really afford. We're wandering around in homes that we'll never own. So many of us are unfulfilled and empty and angry and angsty. And social media becomes this hedonic treadmill that we're always pursuing some degree of pleasure and escapism from, right? And if your pleasure and escapism comes from radical political ideas and online tribalism, and on a micro level, being part of like cancel culture and call out culture, and being part of bringing down the oppressor, or on the other end of the extreme end of it, like organizing violent activities and spreading, racist and sexist ideas, then there's no need to, you're not going to get off it, because you're hooked on it the way people get hooked on drugs and alcohol or porn or like sleeping around, because it takes you away from your inner discomfort. It takes you away from your angst, and takes you away from your anxiety, and yet it exacerbates all those things. And those things spiral until it becomes offline behavior. So I do think that, yeah.
Sorry? What are you teaching the kids is all the different, under the various guises that you operate through, obviously at the Muay Thai kickboxing, PT, the stuff you're doing with MSD, all the different avenues what are you actually teaching to try and curb or assist young people to not get trapped in that the same way they do with drugs or alcohol, with say social media as your example?
This is a relatively new area of understanding and learning for me. So to be honest, I don't do full lectures or talks on social media or online radicalization. But when I talk about mental well-being or mental health or mental fitness, I do incorporate the fact that the data will show us now, if you look at the work of someone like the name escapes me. If you look at some of the data, it'll show you that the more you're online, more anxiety, more depression, more mental distress. And then, of course, a lot of my work is around sexual consent or sexual violence prevention. I have to acknowledge the fact that a lot of that harm is digital. So there's this big social pressure to send nudes or perform sexual acts and record them, send them to the person that you think is cool. That person will have poor understandings or no understandings or not care about consent, and then send that around the school or put that online or put that on a website. And that leads to huge amounts of psychological harm to the victim of that crime, or even worse, attempted suicide, dropping out of school, that sort of stuff. So I try and give young people critical filters, try and give them some explicit understanding around consent, try and give them broader ideas about what we call coping mechanisms, just the way you'd understand it as an alcoholic in recovery. A lot of us get caught in our cell phones without even being aware that we're caught in our cell phones, but we're actually self-soothing the way someone might be if they're drinking every night after work, right? And I know this because I fucking did this when I was really depressed and going through a long, protracted, weird, crazy breakup and divorce. Like, I just got sucked into my cell phone and putting all these painful memes up and like spilling my guts about everything going through my head at 3:37 a.m. because I was an insomniac. And surprisingly, it grew quite a following of people. And looking back on that, I'm like, whoa, that was a nut job. But that's a really human experience now. It does become a place where we can both fill the void and we can put all our feelings into the void, and it kind of feels good for a minute. But then you have this kind of like vaguey, cringy digital history. It's like a flow chart of my mental health is my fucking Instagram account. And so it's about teaching young people that what you put online stays online, and you need to be really mindful and be a bit more intentional and perhaps a little less reactive. But that's hard because it feels good to do it, like on a neurological chemical release level. You get some reward from it, which is rewarding. So you keep on with it, So it's about teaching them, get offline more, leave your phone in the car when you go on a date, build exercise into your routine, and then don't just exercise when you're feeling shitty, do it all the time to stop yourself from feeling shitty. Eat better food. If your blood sugar is seesawing up and down and you're drinking like Monster, Red Bull 24/7, and you're getting wasted every weekend on drugs and alcohol, that's not going to be good for your mental well-being, and you're always going to reach for something to feel better, and your cell phone's part of one of those things that feels better, and then it becomes this really, really sad cycle that we're seeing happen younger and younger and younger, you know? So yeah, it's about teaching them that stuff and teaching them that ultimately, like, a lot of the answers for our inner suffering are within us and between us as human beings. And yeah, increasingly we live in a world where people don't phone call anymore. You know, like, we don't phone call because we give each other panic attacks. You're like seen as a psychopath for phoning someone. Why the fuck did you phone me? It's like, what, is someone dead? Right? Like, you must know people like that, because I do. Yeah. It's like, what, a voice? This is a voice? Where's the emojis? You know? It's crazy, man. And yet that's the world that we live in. And I worry that that's the world that also gets to dominate the public sphere. There is actually like quite a loud, chilled out majority of moderate thinking, reasonably well people out there, but they're not screaming into the fucking ether of the internet. So people just think that it's one extreme or the other. That becomes truth. And yeah, I'm kind of not quite sure how to fix that, because you don't want to encourage people to get like, why didn't you come online? It's a fucking great time. When it could be like, it can be great. I love talking to amazing people on the internet, but also sometimes you'll just be like, dum dum dum. Oh, I ate a fucking vegan burger, and then someone would say something mean to you or whatever. You know what I mean? It's like you just can't express like a harmless enough opinion without. There's a right-wing author conservative author called Douglas Murray, who wrote a book called The Madness of Crowds, which I've read to try and understand, you know, different perspectives. I think he's more conservative than I am politically, but he writes quite succinctly that there are any number of possible ways that you can interpret, say, 140 character sentence on Twitter, right? Like, it's impossible to consider all the different lenses that someone could interpret your words, divorced from time, space, and context of who you are. It's impossible. You can never know how someone else is going to read the words that you've shared, right? And yet someone will be like, but you're this, you're a fascist, or you're a racist, or you're a sexist, or like, you didn't think about the Inuit people, or you didn't think about this. Like, when you just chuck some well-intentioned comment out there, and it's maddening. And so I wouldn't encourage people to like get amongst it. You know what I mean? Like, it is maddening. You asked me earlier, like, do you think it's just showing people how they really are? But no, I'd have to say that it's actually making us worse in some regards. You know, like, it is detrimental to our mental well-being to be online too much and be engaged in those highly politicized spaces too much. I think, at least. What do you think?
What's been some of? Oh, what do I think about that? I don't know. I haven't, like you said, I haven't done a detailed sort of how would you put it? I haven't done a download of all the proper, you know, peer-reviewed literature on it, so I don't really know. It's impossible to say, like, just say off anecdotal evidence from the internet. Chicken and egg.
Yeah, I'm trying really hard to not be a guy who makes my subjective experiences pass for objective reality, you know. But so that's why I'm reading journalistic work. I'm looking at the decline of the mainstream media, the fact that there's such a preponderance of voices now that there's the democratization of publication, and some people who write are fucking lunatics, and yet there's an audience for everyone out there, you know. Literally, people believe that 5G causes coronavirus, and we're setting fire to fucking cell phone towers. That's the world that we live in. People believe that the deep state cabal, and they storm the capital of the United States based on like the most nuts conspiracy theories. And on the other end of it, everyone is a racist and everyone's a fascist and everyone's a sexist, and like words just become meaningless to the point that it's like everything's a superlative, everything's trauma, everything's abuse. So what actually do we use when there is actual trauma or actual abuse? I don't know. I feel like the internet's kind of done a wonderful job of bringing really important conversations to light, like Me Too, for example, Harvey Weinstein, and the endemic sexual violence that's part of industries like Hollywood. And we're addressing that, and that's a wonderful, important, powerful conversation we all need to be part of. But then it's kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater at the same time, because you do see like stories of Jesse Smollett. Do you remember that story? Is it Jesse Smollett? He's an African American actor who I'm gonna fuck this story up, but Dave Chappelle talks about it. Basically, Dave Chappelle is my favorite comedian and at the same time social commentator. But he talks about it's Jesse Smollett or something like that. He's an African American actor who said that two guys in mega caps attacked him, put a noose around his neck. I think he alleged that they poured bleach on him and said some racist epithets. Turned out to be like a completely made up story. And it's just kind of like, yo, like when that's the case, then how do we genuinely address, because there are a lot of racist people out there, don't get me wrong. Like, I think society is still structurally racist.
All the work you're doing with
I think people of color get treated far worse by banks and the police, and there is data to support all of that. But we need to bring moderates into that conversation to end that shit. And stories like that and hyperbolic conversations online like that don't bring moderates into the conversation. They make them disbelieving and skeptical. And that I still care about the same shit. I've just seen the way that we talk about these things.
I heard a really good thing a while ago about how real change actually has to come from the moderates, and it has to come from, quote, within, and why. And there was some talk around why protests don't work and how it has to be people within the power structure that perhaps felt marginalized or perhaps were marginalized to some extent, but had managed to infiltrate the halls of power, so to speak, and then to change countries. So I think like what I was thinking about, what you were saying, all the great work you're doing with young people, but at the same time, there probably needs to be, and you'll have a lot to say about this, I'm sure, work done with the parents of these people as well, because there's no good, you doing what you're doing. Well, it's not, there is good, but there's great good, but coming home, if the message from the parents and the example is diametrically opposed to all the great things you've been doing for a 40-minute window in a talk, same way that if we're going around and saying from outside the power structure, these are the sort of what people who are perceived as marginalized think things should be like, or etc. But all of a sudden, because we're such sheep as human beings, if people we see as respectful or above, a rung above, or how we want to be perceived, are touting this kind of message, then people in droves start to go for it. The same way house prices go. I know this is a slightly odd, segue, but the same way that house prices have gone ballistic lately, but there's less goods and services being exchanged on the whole during the whole COVID period, and less people working. So how are asset prices going up? It's just because a chosen few elites decided that it's a good thing to pile money into that now. There's no difference. Social issues, financial, it's this herd mentality of, David Jones and his friend down the road who have $20 million worth of property are buying this, and this. All of a sudden, every time Harry's doing it. So how do we do that in the area you're in? And you're an example, without pissing in your pocket too much, Richie, of someone who is perceived as being a leader. You're eloquent, you're a good looking man, you're able to talk to people in a persuasive way. I'm not feeling too randy yet, but it is only 1:30. But yeah,
Well,
you're a guy who people look up to, and
my
you're
girlfriend's away,
trying.
and it's Pride Month, so anyway, it is crazy when you talk about
possibility, but you are space who they look up to, definitely.
Oh, I don't know about that anymore, but thank you. That's kind of you to say. I was reading a great article by Chloe Swarbrick. Speaking of people who've gone from the outside to inside, like I met Chloe when we did radio together at BFM. And I always thought she was amazing. I was very impressed. I was like, yo, I think she was like 17 when she hosted the radio show before me, which was a news and current affairs show. She wrote a great article in the Herald yesterday about wealth inequality, which is something that it's kind of dropped out of the conversation in politics a lot of these days. When I came to a degree of political consciousness, it came from a deep desire to understand the poverty I'd seen in Latin America firsthand. I've been traveling around with my ex-wife, and kids would come up and lick our plates and leave us in tears, poverty in parts of Mexico that we saw.
Yeah,
it's nuts. So when I went to uni, everything was very class conscious. And that's kind of to me, I think one of the biggest social schism is class inequality at the moment. Rather than, the political discourse at present, and I might get canceled for saying this, is dominated by identity politics issues, which are important issues, and we need to address those. But I think in Chloe's article, she highlighted that I think the top 10% of the country own 52 or 53% of the country's wealth, and it's inverse in that 52% of the country own 10% of the country. I can't remember the statistics, but you get the point I'm making in that it's an increasingly small bubble of people who own all the property and are responsible for the inability to do simple things like buy a house. They're not personally responsible for it. Don't get me wrong. I know friends who are landlords, and I like them as people and I love them. But the market is geared.
The system
and the market is geared not in favor of most of us. The fact that, this is I bum out about this. I want to open a physical space, right? I want a physical space that I can embed all my ethos into and have young people come through and do presentations and workshops. And I run a social enterprise, whereas obviously I make a profit off teaching kickboxing and boxing, and we can do some public speaking in there and stuff. But if you haven't got money, if you're in drug rehab, if you are in a program with youth, then you don't pay any money, right? We could get that funded, whatever. It's just impossible to find a building that's affordable to do that in. Do you know what I mean? Around the Auckland City Fringe.
I can tell you what.
And part of that, and again, it's the system. It's because I
don't necessarily. We can have our first public fight, Richie. I don't necessarily agree.
Well, I was just going to let me just quickly finish the point. Is that because for a landlord, it's easier to keep the space empty because we think supply and demand, right? There's not a lot of demand for rents in this environment, for rentals in this environment, and we've seen a lot of property go on to the market. So you're basic supply and demand would make me think that the cost of renting a building will go down until things balance, right? That's basic. That's the basic law of economics as far as I'm aware of it. But that's not what's happened. What's happened is that landlords just keep their spaces empty because should they lower the market rental rate, it devalues the worth of their property on the market. And they're much better off keeping it empty and making a huge capital gain when they sell that building eventually. So they keep it artificially, they keep the price of the building artificially high, and middle to working class people can't just start a business. Well, at least around here. I mean, don't get me wrong. I can move to Oratia. I can move to Henderson.
I think this is probably a sort of a bit of advertising for lateral lawyers and my own skills here, but it's probably a conversation we should be having off here. But what the hell? I think there's ways around that, and I think that if you go to a landlord in that position and say, I'm trying to get off the ground, and we say, look, we just want to be here for 3 months. We don't even need to have a formal lease agreement. We'll pay you cash. You take the cash. It's not going to go on the record as a deed of lease. Someone will agree.
Isn't that takes it? You teach
no people right now who we could call after this that would agree to that for you. And I think there is too a real dichotomy between the macroeconomic in terms of these people, like you said, who have just oodles and oodles of property and just wealth in general, and the microeconomic case of, say, someone like yourself who, and I've been through this myself too, where I want to go in my life, and I'm going through a phase where I'm really focused on doing a lot of content for my business and growing my business, so that when I'm 50, which is only about 10 years away now, I have a bit more of the most valuable resource of all, which is time. But I've studied people in the last year, and the guys who have really cracked it at some point really dug in for work some long hours and really focused on making some money so they could free themselves up to do the things perhaps they really want to do. And so for someone like yourself now, to have a bit more comfort, to have a little bit more of a buffer so you can actually get into that space and do that stuff, it is sometimes worth, even though it goes to your natural grain or of who you are, to focus somewhat on building, just a reasonable deposit or bank bond or something, and spending the time trying to find that space, because in the macro, in the longer term or medium to longer term, you can actually have a longer, more comfortable run at the life you really want to live. So, I mean, it's all just academic because we're talking conceptually here, but I think there is a lot of opportunity for people. I know a couple of young entrepreneurial people, like the lady we had on yesterday, Jess Ryder over in Aussie. Incredible story how she started out in an Anytime Fitness, thought I could do this for myself. She literally hired like 12 square meters of space in another gym, and then hired some for cheap off a really established guy, a gym sort of magnate equipment. And now she's got a 400 square meter gym with no financial assistance from parents, banks, anything else. And I know she's obviously freakishly talented, but she's also incredibly determined to do well. So I think you can. I'm not saying it's easy, and I'm not saying that everyone can do it, but I think it's possible if you just really zero in on that and have perhaps access to this kind of conversation that you and I are having now, and her and I had yesterday, about what you need to do. Because a lot of people would do it if they thought that there was a reasonable chance of success. They would go, okay, show me the roadmap. And there's not a lot of access to that information for people to know that roadmap to move in that direction.
Yeah, that's interesting that you say that. I think that kind of ties into some of the things we've been talking about today. When you talk about like intersectional inequality, do you know what I mean? Like, I have access to people like yourself where perhaps other people might not. And that is something that I'm curious to, I don't know the answer to that. Anyway.
I'll give you another quick example. So Luella, who you know, who works for us, she's worked for us since she was 19. She was doing a property degree when we met her, and she got into law school, and now her little sister's got into law school. Now, I taught Lou a lot, mentored her Lou a lot, and now Lou has taught me, her little sister, all of that. Now, they didn't come from a family that were at Auckland Grammar St Cuthbert's that were almost institutionalized within the family, and years of producing lawyers like I grew up with, and it happens all the time. And so we're not getting sometimes the best talent through the law schools. We're getting the people who are groomed from 5 or 6 at St Cuthbert's or Auckland Grammar or King's or Dio into these law schools, the same problem they're having in med schools. So it's that access to people who have walked those paths before them, and people are able to then back off that, and then hopefully, like Luella's done, is give back to the next generation. So you're pulling people through. Often it's not a gap in aptitude or ability, it's a gap in access to people that have walked the path before you.
Yeah, they call that, there's actually a whole theory around that. There's a guy called Pierre Bourdieu who talked about social capital. Yeah. That stuck with me. I studied education for a minute. I thought I'd be a school teacher, but I changed my mind. But that really stuck with me from 20 years ago when I think about, social capital. Like you say, like if your parents went to a good school and you went to a good school and you meet like you get like a great after school job with your parents' friends' law firm or whatever. That's far different than if your parents have a working class job and your parents' friend or your parents' friends are unemployed or whatever. You know what I mean? I think that's where I do get frustrated with that neoliberal pull yourself up by your own bootstraps thing, because I'm like, yo, everyone's bootstraps are different, man. You know, like, but although within that, I don't know, fuck, it gets nuanced. Hey, this has been great. I'd love to talk more. Although I do have to push on because I've got an event that I'm organizing.
2 o'clock.
Yeah. I've got an event that I'm organizing Sunday. I've got to go out and meet the landlord. Hey, this has been great, man. You're the man. I've enjoyed talking about this. I forget that when I'm well slept and caffeinated, I can string a few sentences together. Thank you.
Thank you, mate. And we'll talk about your file afterwards.
Yeah. Okay, bro. I'd love that. Okay, you're the man.
Questions for you. I send through to him.
What's that?
I think Liam's still waiting for some stuff for you.
I've got one thing to send him. Yeah. It's because I'm like herding cats. You know how it is when you're trying to get other people. But yeah, tell Liam I love him and that I'll get that documentation to him as soon as possible. Okay. Thanks, brother. Appreciate it. Okay. Bye.